I want to begin this session with a quote from an author named Christopher Hitchens. Christopher Hitchens years ago wrote a book called God is Not Great: How Religion Poisons Everything. And here's one of the quotes, the more famous quotes from that book. He says, "Violent, irrational, intolerant, allied to racism and tribalism and bigotry, invested in ignorance and hostile to free inquiry, contemptuous of women and coercive towards children, organized religion ought to have a great deal on its conscience." His thesis in the book, explained by the subtitle, is that organized religion is a curse. Organized religion, Christianity in particular, poisons everything. And so in this session, I want to address the scandal of religious belief, the scandal of Christianity. I want to address the charge that skeptics make that religion, and Christianity in particular, is not only outdated, it's actually poisonous. Specifically, it's poisonous to progress and science. That's what I want to address in this particular session. So first of all, some would argue that Christianity is false because violence has been committed in the name of Christianity. Some want to argue that Christianity is false because violence has been committed in the name of Christianity. Now, to that I say, well, yes, that's obviously true, unfortunately. It is true that historically and even in present day, violence is sometimes committed in the name of Jesus. So if you remember several sessions ago, I said one of my tactics that I take when talking to an unbeliever is I'm going to agree until I have to disagree. And here's one of those instances where I have to unfortunately own the fact that Christians have not always been faithful in following Jesus in this world. Sometimes even violently they followed Jesus in this world. But I also think there are some responses that we can make to this charge that Christianity is violent, that religious belief is violent. The first response that I would make to this charge is that it's committing a fallacy called a hasty generalization. It reduces all Christianity down to its worst possible expressions. So what if we applied the same standard to secularism? What if I, as a believer, said, well, look at what happens in secular nations and secular governments? What if we looked at the example of communist Russia? Or what if we looked at the example of communist China? Or so many different examples that we could give, even going back like to the French Revolution, all these secular uprisings, these secular governments, and just how violent and bloody they have indeed been. I've had this conversation with atheists, and they get very agitated. They get very irritated, and they'll say, well, that doesn't represent what secularism is all about. And I would say, well, maybe that's true. I'm going to grant you that. Maybe that's true. But if that's true in your case, then maybe it's also true in the case of Christians acting violently in the world. See, what you're doing is you're making a hasty generalization. You're making a judgment about religious faith based on only the worst expressions of it. Whenever you see a person acting violently in the world, you need to ask the question, is this violence the logical expression of their ideology? So in other words, was their ideology leading them necessarily to this point? Or is this violence an aberration to their ideology? So in other words, it's inconsistent with what they believe. And I would argue that a Christian acting violently in this world is they're not acting out the implications of their belief. They're actually contradicting the nature of the gospel. Here's another thing that I would say in response to this charge. It also commits what's called a false cause fallacy. It looks at much of the violence that has taken place in the world. And it falsely attributes religious belief as the primary or the principal cause for that violence and that bloodshed that has occurred. But if you actually look at these historical examples that they sometimes give, like the so-called religious wars in Europe, what you realize is the cause of that violence and bloodshed was incredibly complicated and nuanced. To say that it was simply a byproduct of religious belief is to turn a blind eye to the actual historical events and how they unfolded. So it's a false cause fallacy. It's also what's called an ad hominem fallacy. An ad hominem is when you reject an idea or you reject a belief simply because of the person that holds the belief. And here's a good way of illustrating this. So we know that 2 + 3 = 5. Now, what if I told you that the person I learned 2 + 3 = 5 from, that the person I learned that from is an awful person who loves to drop kick puppies for fun? Okay? So does that mean, because I learned this truth from an awful person, does that mean that the truth is therefore false? Should I reject 2 + 3 = 5 because of the person who taught me that truth? Well, clearly not. 2 + 3 still equals 5, regardless of the person who taught it to me. And that's an extreme example, obviously, but I would say the same thing about a person who rejects Christianity because of a particular Christian that they met, or because of the way that particular groups of Christians have conducted themselves historically or even presently. None of that behavior is a justification for saying automatically, well, Christianity must be false. It's an ad hominem fallacy. Now, some people would say, so that's one charge, that religious belief, and Christianity in particular, is a violent belief. And to that, I would say, well, you're committing at least 3 fallacies when you make that argument. Other people argue that Christianity is antiquated and anti-progress. So it's not so much just that it's violent, it's also just it's unnecessary and it's against making progress in this world. So Christianity holds us back, in other words. And to that, I would say, this is simply not true historically. It ignores or dismisses the good that's been done by the church, by Christians in particular, through the centuries. If you want a couple resources that talk about this, I'll point you to a couple resources. One is a book written by a man named Alvin Schmidt. It's called How Christianity Changed the World. And he goes into great lengths in the book to talk about how every culture that Christianity entered into was blessed by that. Christianity was a revolution in regards to things like healthcare. It was a revolution in regards to things like the rights of women and protecting young at-risk individuals, workplace reform, prison reform, scientific progress. He just goes down the line in all of these different categories. Historically, when Christianity enters into a culture, that culture is blessed as a result. Another resource that I would point you to is by a man named Rodney Stark, who wrote a book called The Triumph of Christianity, where he makes a similar type of argument. That one of the reasons why Christianity exploded in the Roman world was because of the particular way that Christians and the church were conducting themselves publicly. And they became so compelling to the broader world that they grew as a result. And so anybody that makes the charge that Christianity is just anti-progress, that Christianity wants to take us backward, they just haven't studied the historical record. The historical record actually says the opposite. Now, I'll also offer one more response to this charge. The second response that I would make to this charge is, let's not assume that all progress is necessarily good. I'm not going to accept that assumption. The assumption is, well, religious belief, it holds us back from making progress. And religious believers, Christians in particular, would say, well, I'm not convinced that what you say is progress is really progress in the right direction. So sometimes, oftentimes, Christian belief is actually a blessing by pulling in the reins of what people regard as progress. Now, here's the third charge that's made. So it's violent, it's anti-progress. The third charge that's sometimes made is that Christianity, religion, and Christianity in particular, are anti-science. They're anti-science. This is a quote from Christopher Hitchens once again. He says, talking about himself, talking about atheists as he was, our belief is not a belief. Our principles are not a faith. We do not rely solely upon science and reason because they are necessary rather than sufficient factors, but we distrust anything that contradicts science or outrages reason. We may differ on many things, but what we respect is free inquiry, open-mindedness, and the pursuit of ideas for their own sake. So what Hitchens is highlighting here is, from his perspective, there is a fundamental contradiction between faith and science. We don't have faith, we have science. Now, let me just say outright that there is no contradiction between faith and science. There simply is no contradiction. Science is simply the discipline of studying some aspect of our world. That's what science is. It's the discipline of studying some aspect of our world. And so many of the first scientists, if you go back in the history of science, so many of the first scientists were not only practicing Christians, they were actually pastors, theologians. Science was born out of Christian belief. Science wasn't born despite Christian belief. It was born in a cultural environment where Christian belief was the norm. That's where science developed. So this idea that somehow there's a contradiction between faith and science, it ignores the historical record that shows historically faith and science have cohered fairly well. There is, however, a contradiction between faith and what's called scientism. Scientism. Now, scientism, let me give you a definition of this. Scientism is the conviction that scientific knowledge, particularly that knowledge derived from natural sciences, is the highest or only form of knowledge. That's what scientism says. Let me give you that definition again. Scientism is the conviction that scientific knowledge, particularly that knowledge derived from natural sciences, is the highest or even the only form of knowledge. So what that Christopher Hitchens quote is revealing is it's revealing a particular worldview called scientism. He says there's a contradiction between faith and science. That's not true. But there is a contradiction between faith and the worldview of scientism that says the only thing that matters, the only truth or the only knowledge that matters in this world is knowledge that is derived from science. That is, I would argue, that is a religious conviction. He's articulating a religious conviction, only instead of God being at the center, science is now at the center. And my response to scientism is threefold. There's three responses that we can make to scientism. And these are all things that science is actually incapable of doing. There are at least three things that science cannot do. The first thing that science cannot do is be infallible. Science cannot be final or infallible. The book of science is never closed because we're always learning more. We're always discovering more. Some of what we discover today challenges or contradicts what we think we discovered yesterday. Science is an open book in that way. So you always know that you're talking to a person who's adopted scientism when they talk about science as if it's a closed book, that the science on everything is settled. We've proven this beyond any shadow of a doubt. Well, that's not science. That's actually more akin to a religious type of conviction. Science by its nature can't be infallible, which is one of the reasons why Christians initially began the discipline and started the discipline of science, because they wanted to learn more about this world that God had created. They were curious about it, and they believed that you could actually learn more about God by studying the things that God has made. And so science, properly understood, is a curious epistemology. It's always looking to learn and discover more. Scientism, on the other hand, wants to keep that book closed. Here's the second thing that science cannot do. Science cannot talk about non-physical realities. It can't deal with non-physical realities. Science can't deal with things like morals and values and meaning and purpose and the soul. Science is incapable of talking about those things. And so the problem that scientism has is scientism necessarily has to rule out the existence of anything that's non-physical. Scientism has to explain away the existence of consciousness and the soul. It has to explain away the existence of morals and values and religious convictions. It has to explain them away because it can't really deal with non-physical realities. It's limited in that way. So scientism argues that there's a contradiction between faith and science because in their mind, there is nothing other than science. There's nothing other than the study of the physical world, to which millions and even billions of people would say, well, I'm not so sure about that. There are all sorts of non-physical realities that are some of the most important things about our life. Things like meaning and purpose and all the love even. There are all these non-physical realities that give our life purpose that scientism is completely incapable of addressing. Here's the third thing. And it's related to the second point, but science cannot give moral values. Science can tell you what is. Science can tell you what exists, but science cannot tell you what ought to be. Science can't give moral values, moral directions. It can simply describe the world as it is. And so science is limited. I love science, and Christians everywhere should love science. If you love God, you should love science, because science, again, is the study of the world that God has made. Christians should have a very, very friendly relationship with science. Scientism, on the other hand, I believe is toxic to the faith and contradictory to the faith, and we are right to challenge the assumptions that are made in scientism. So I've covered three things in this session. Three things that are regarded as scandalous about religious belief and Christian belief in particular. We talked about the notion that Christian belief is violent and should therefore be resisted or rejected. We talked about the idea that Christian belief is anti-progress, that it's poisonous to cultures. We challenge that notion. And then thirdly, we talked about this relationship between faith and science. And is it true that Christian faith is actually anti-science? And I would argue, no, it's not true at all. It's anti-scientism, but it's certainly not anti-science.